Hey guys, welcome to Module 5. So this week, we're going to have you look at a couple different ideas in the discussion board assignment. Um, and then I also want to spend a few minutes talking about your Milestone 2 assignment. So our discussion board assignment this week has you focusing on how local government can minimize the impact of a poor economy. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Some of them are a little bit off target, but I think it's important to understand that local government needs to continue to take steps to make sure that it remains solvent and that their expenditures don't exceed their revenues or they find themselves in some type of fiscal crisis, such as the inability to fund local retirement programs. So we're going to spend some time on that. And then we'll also talk about consolidations, mergers, and shared services, which some of you have talked about over the last couple of weeks in our previous discussion assignment. So I think you'll find them to be a little bit not necessarily redundant, but we've already talked about these to some extent. Now we're just going to be talking about them in a more focused environment. Okay. So before we get into the discussion assignments, let me talk about identification of topics. So this week on your Milestone 2 assignment, you need to submit at least 4 topics or concepts that you plan to use as the basis for your interview. Explain why you chose these specific concepts for your project. And what my suggestion would be to do is to look at some of our previous milestone or our previous module assignments and see how you can apply some of that information to your final paper and your interview process. All right, because I think that will best serve you, because those are things that are part of the overall goals and objectives of the course, and it's an area that you already have some familiarity with because you've written either a short paper or some discussion board assignments have been focusing on some of these things. So I'm just going to highlight real quick some of those things that we have talked about. And those are governance structures, which is whether or not your participant is part of a council manager form, strong mayor, weak mayor, or commission style form of local governance. We talked about different programs and services that we had to evaluate whether what you thought was most important. And so clearly you can ask them what they thought is most important. The duties and responsibilities that are also the most important and that they find the most difficult. Okay, so these are a couple of things we've already talked about. You can also focus in, if you wish, on the level of citizen participation in terms of the administrative decision making, if that exists at all, and then maybe even talk about level of volunteer programs and the benefit to the community and to the city in having citizens that at some level participate in the local government process. Finally, we'll be spending some time on that today, this idea of consolidation, but you can look at consolidation in terms of your interview. You can find out whether or not the party you're interviewing, what their views are on consolidation. Has their agency done any level of consolidation? If so, what that level of consolidation has been, pros and cons, and so forth. Home rule, we'll be talking about that next week, so you can ask about that. That is really the ability of the city to have a little more say in their future and not rely so much on state law. Demographic shifts in the community, have they experienced that? If so, pros and cons. Have they seen a shift in services based on shifts in demographics? Those type of issues. And then decision-making process that we've already talked about. What steps are used to, for example, eliminate or reduce a service? What experience do they have in that? And maybe they can share some ideas with you about that. All right. So those are the kind of things that you can start looking at. Again, I just identified some of these real quick, and that was basically from just going over our assignments. Okay. So take a look at the assignment guidelines and grading rubric. and then, oh, there's no grading rubric, but take a look at the assignment guidelines and make sure that you're on track and that you identify clearly identify some concepts and ideas and topics that you can tie back to your interview that you're going to be working on here in the next couple of weeks, right? So that having been said, let's move on to the next topic, which is minimizing the impact of a poor economy on local government. So here we're going to be looking at what it is that local government can do or has done to minimize the effects of a poor economy. Now, we've been talking about this off and on in different formats over the last week or so, but I think it's important that you really have an idea as to what local government should be doing in anticipation of another round of poor economic growth, for example, that's going to impact how local government is able to provide the services and programs that they offer. So how do you minimize the impact of a poor economy? Now, there's a couple of things I want to talk about before I really get into this, and I only discuss this because several states have gone to this model. California is one of them. And in fact, Heather Pugh in our class is the one who had a link to the state of California's auditor's website. And what the state auditor does now is the state auditor basically evaluates California cities and then gives them a rating, which helps identify whether or not they are sort of in the green in a handful of categories, that they're functioning properly, whether or not they're in the yellow, which means that you potentially could have a problem down the road, and red means you really do have a problem. And I'll go over some of these categories that they look at. But the tools that they recommend to minimize the fiscal crisis is the first step is for states to monitor local government finances in order to predict distress. So they have some idea when a city is nearing that tipping point. Second is step in for states to work with local governments to ameliorate the problem. In other words, how can we improve it? How can we make things better? What is it that local government is not doing that perhaps state auditors might be able to share some practical experiences or examples of what other cities are doing to try to address whatever long-term issues may be facing that particular community. Third step, if help is insufficient to keep the problem from getting worse, states should step in and take over local government until stabilized. So here we see where local government is taking on a more monitoring role to ensure that local government is using their money wisely and that they are not getting in over their head. And so I'll share that link with you, but now I just want to go over a couple of areas that, in this case, the California auditor, state auditors, what they look for. A couple of things they look for is liquidity, in other words, your cash position, how much cash you have, debt burden, financial reserves, what you have in the bank, revenue trends. Are you developing different sources of revenue, or is revenue beginning to increase or decrease, and maybe why? Ability to pay employees retirement benefits is critical. The unemployment rate within a community, which can have an adverse effect on the incoming revenue. Future pension costs, in other words, what have communities, cities agreed to with their retirees in terms of pension costs, both in pay and maybe health insurance. The population, is the population growing? Is it declining, or is it stagnant? Those might be keys as to how vibrant the community is and maybe what steps might be needed to engage the community to become more robust. And the whole idea being, if you get more people, then you have more money coming in, but you have to have more services. But it also is one of them places that maybe people want to live. And so population trends are very important to follow. Other things that governments can do, and we talked about some of these already in some previous announcements or discussion boards, was user fees. Some cities are using utility fees. Utilities are taxed at a particular rate, such as maybe cable TV, that sort of stuff. Just as in the past where cities have embraced gambling, now we find that cities are beginning to embrace, in those states where it's legal, marijuana dispensaries, with the idea of bringing in more potential revenue to help local government. That's a double-edged sword on that, and I think the numbers quite haven't reached where they thought it would be, especially in California. Most likely because of the black market, which can sell the same type of marijuana much cheaper. Other things cities can do is obviously hiring freeze, which some of you have talked about, pay benefits reduction, outsourcing of non-essential services such as janitorial services, reducing the frequency of services. So instead of having a street sweeper come by every other week, now they come by once a month, and now they come by quarterly, whatever the case is. And also, some cities have gone to eliminating vacant positions, in other words, not even having them on the books. And then if an agency wants those positions back, then they'll have to go back and justify the need for those positions later on. Okay. Other things, again, is evaluate those financial risk factors mentioned in terms of the potential debt, financial reserves, those kind of things we just talked about. Tax collection is now online, sales subject to local taxes. So that's one of the pluses I think that's come out recently, is that when you buy something with Amazon, for example, then your local tax rate is calculated into that, and then those tax dollars go back to your local community and or your state. Some other things considered is diversify the type of taxes. In other words, diversify the level of the type of revenue that you're getting. Try not to put all your eggs in one basket. So if you rely heavily on property taxes and property values begin to decline, then that's going to impact your overall revenue sources. So again, the need to somehow diversify the types of taxes that you get as part of whatever relationship you have with the state. Defer equipment replacement. So maybe instead of getting that new trash truck, you're going to put it off another year or two, that new fire engine, whatever the case is. And then something we'll talk about a little bit later, this whole idea of consolidation of services. All right. And we're going to spend some time talking about that here in just a minute. So again, these are things that local government can do. And you guys have talked about this before, so I don't want to beat this horse to death. But local officials need to plan ahead and need to have strategies in place on how to minimize the impact of any type of future downturn on the economy. And one of those is just like you and I in our own personal financial situation, is to develop a savings account so that if something happens, you have some monies available to you to carry you through, hopefully several months. All right. So let me move on to the idea of consolidation, mergers, and shared services. And this is the second half of our discussion this week in terms of looking at consolidating or merging or sharing services and what local government is trying to do in mitigating some of its costs. And so I'm going to talk about that here in just a minute, but I'm going to stop here and we're going to go to part 2. Thanks, guys.